Great. Well, thanks so much, Lauren, and thanks everyone for joining us this afternoon. Welcome to the CRC Roundtable. This is a monthly virtual seminar series. The intent of this series of meetings is to host targeted, inclusive, and informed conversations that match scientific advances, management needs, and really to build our community around the Chesapeake Bay. As a reflection of that intent, the panelists you're going to hear from in the next few minutes will take about half of the hour. And then we'd like to open the floor to your questions, and we certainly welcome every question is a good question. These webinars are recorded and past seminars are available on the CRC webpage. And we certainly encourage people to look back at this series. We also ask that everyone stays muted with your camera off during the presentations. And when we get to the Q&A, we invite people to put their name into the chat feature so we can record the various participants. I'd also like to highlight that this is the second, what we're calling member takeover of the CRC Roundtable, with the first being ODU's presentation in January of this year. I'd also like to say to the attendees that we'll get to as many of the questions as we can in the next hour or so, but if we don't get to your questions, we will be capturing all of those questions and we'll respond to you directly after the event. And before we get going, I would like to acknowledge the really great job that Dr. Wardrop and the CRC staff do. This program is understated but highly impactful. It networks universities, researchers, managers, students that are totally committed to Bay issues. And when we were deciding what we would talk about today on behalf of the University System of Maryland, we chose topics which cover most of our institutions, certainly all of our states, with the intent of helping to disseminate the various programs and to seek further collaboration, cooperation, and communication around these key topics. And to that end, I'd also like to highlight, for those of you who aren't aware of it, Randy Rowell's wonderful NSF-supported C-Stream program. So with that, I'm going to share my screen and great. We're going to cover briefly 4 topics. First of all, to give an overview of the University System of Maryland and particularly our own institution, UMCES. I'm then going to just touch on where Maryland is and our approach to climate change. And then you're going to hear from 2 of our stars, and I'll introduce those at the end of this brief introduction. One will be discussing diversity, equity, and inclusion, just one of the existential threats. And then the other will be Dr. Katie May Laumann, who's going to be talking about how we assess and communicate progress on these huge multi-billion-dollar ecosystem recovery programs. So the University System of Maryland comprises 12 institutions. A couple of things about this university system. The University of Maryland, Baltimore and College Park have a combined research enterprise that exceeds $1 billion a year. And this makes Maryland one of 4 states in the Union that has 2 institutions with research enterprises in excess of $1 billion a year. That's, of course, Johns Hopkins and the university system. Specifically, the University of Maryland Center for Environmental Science, we're just coming up to our centenary in 1925. We started at the Chesapeake Biological Lab down on Solomon's Island, and we were founded by Reginald Pruitt Laboratory at that time. And over the years, we've grown, and our tagline is that we study genes to ecosystems and from mountains to oceans. Geographically, we're distributed across the state at 6 locations, plus the research vessel, the Rachel Carson. Without highlighting all of these, I would like to just point out that our Appalachian lab that deals with the upper watershed and mountain issues is also home to the Chesapeake Watershed CSU, or the Cooperative Ecosystem Studies Unit, in collaboration with the National Park Service. And most of the institutions throughout the watershed are a member of that group. So we were founded with a unique mission. We're just a graduate university, although we have extensive K-12 and internship programs. But we were founded specifically to provide the scientific knowledge base that supports the state of Maryland in the management of her natural resources and the recovery of Chesapeake Bay. And this is just one example where researchers at both our Horn Point lab and the Chesapeake Biological Lab have been assisting the Department of Natural Resources on the oyster stock assessment and managing oysters in Maryland. And of course, collectively, and a part of our mission is always to work with others. And collectively, our institutions host many, many researchers and managers from across the world that come to see how the recovery of Chesapeake Bay as one of the most studied estuaries in the world is progressing, and how we interact across 6 states and Washington, D.C. Within our institution, UMCES, we work around 5 fundamental principles. Obviously, most of our research these days is focusing on adaptation and mitigation to climate, and also sustaining biodiversity. But the 2 topics which we're covering today, one is helping address the challenge of diversifying the environmental sciences. And the 4th one on the list here, when you're investing billions of dollars into these large-scale ecosystem recovery programs, how do you assess that and communicate effectively to policymakers and the public? So stepping back a little bit further to look at Maryland's emphasis on climate. For those of you who are not familiar with the commitment that Maryland's made, I would direct you to the Maryland Commission on Climate Change webpage. We've always had very aggressive legislation, but in 2022, the Climate Solutions Now Act passed that gives us the most ambitious goals of any state in the Union. Not only are we going to be net zero by 2045, but we have to have 60% reduction by 2031. And that's a real challenge when you think some of the tools that are available to you. But this also has to be achieved through the lens of ensuring the state's economic development continues, and it has to be viewed through a lens of environmental justice in everything we do. And the reason for mentioning that to this group is, of course, many of the actions we're going to take in the state of Maryland has direct linkages and synergies with actions that the state are doing for the recovery of Chesapeake Bay. Without going into the details, this state spends a lot of time collecting data and analyzing. And so much of why our legislature and governors take climate so seriously is because the huge economic impacts which we're experiencing in the state. This just shows the increase in the number of billion-dollar disasters since the 1980s. We also have very thorough data on the rising incidence of the effects of climate on human health. So what you're going to hear now is one example from one of our institutes, IMET, on trying to diversify the workforce in the environmental sciences. And I'm sure most of you are aware of the incredibly impactful paper from Bernard and Cooperative that show that despite the attention that the federal government and states have been placing on diversifying the workforce, we've made no significant difference proportionally in the number of PhDs that we're generating. Eric Schott, who you'll hear from, is at the Institute of Marine and Environmental Technology. He has a PhD in genetics from the Harvard Medical School. His expertise is in aquatic health, particularly pathogens in the blue crab and shellfish. He received the UMCES Outstanding Faculty Mentor Award in 2022, and this year he upped himself where he was given the 2023 University System of Maryland Regents Award for Excellence for his efforts in providing opportunities for underserved students. Then you'll be hearing from Dr. Katie May Laumann, who received her PhD in marine science from the Virginia Institute of Marine Science. She's worked on seafood sustainability, sturgeon recovery, but currently she's working as a science integrator and a science communicator. She synthesizes large, diverse scientific knowledge and investigates ways of communicating that effectively. Both of these topics are critically important, and we recognize the great innovation and programs that are going on across the various states at our institutions. But the point of picking these two topics was to explore ideas for enhanced collaboration and continuing the established preeminence of the Chesapeake community in these areas. So with that, I'd like to stop sharing my screen and I will pass the floor to Dr. Schott.
Thank you, Peter. It's good to meet everyone. Thanks for the introduction. I'm going to get straight to the slides and make sure these are presenting okay. So I'm here at the Institute of Marine and Environmental Technology in Baltimore. I'm going to talk about 20 plus years of trying to diversify the workforce in environmental and fisheries science. And I'm just going to start this with a shout out to Dr. Rose Jagus, who began both of these programs with collaborations with UMES and NOAA. And I'll tell you a little bit more about that. And I picked up the reins of that a couple of years ago. I won't go too much into IMET, except to say that these are the main themes from our strategic plan. We work on water, energy, the environment, sustainable seafood production, animal and human health. And in the environmental side, we're listing here the sub-bullets: biodiversity, ecosystem restoration, microbial processes, conservation of water, and energy for a carbon neutral future. These are all themes that I think Peter touched on in his introductory notes. They affect everyone, and yet we have a science community that looks a lot like me and Peter, and we need more diversity, and we need more innovation, and we need more inclusion if we're going to solve these big problems. There's a justice issue, but there's also the practical side that we've been in charge of this for a long time, and we haven't solved these problems yet. Go to the next slide. He already showed us the paper from Bernard and Cooperative. The numbers are sort of staggering. From 1973 to 2016, almost 20,000 PhDs awarded to white recipients, all of 860 to Black and Hispanic recipients, and 2/3 of those were to Hispanic recipients. And so in Baltimore, a majority Black city, it's just very striking every day to see that the people that are being affected by climate change are not represented in the scientific community that's studying it and making changes in it. So this PhD discrepancy, I don't think anyone would disagree, perpetuates environmental injustices. I'm not going to go into that, but I think we need to think about what can be done differently. And I'm not the only one. We know we need to do things differently. So what is UMCES doing, and what could we be doing? If we look at, I'm going to just talk about two programs right now, undergraduate internships at IMET and graduate fellowships in fishery science in collaboration with the University of Maryland Eastern Shore using money from NOAA. If I have time, I'll touch on a couple of other initiatives because I think this is very much a all of the above and a both and kind of approach. We need to change who's doing the science and include more. So the good news is that in our last commencement a year ago, we had 4 students coming through the graduate program that I'm going to talk about. Shadesha Green, Amar Hanif, Nick Coleman, and Benjamin Fry. It was a really great day at CBL when people stepped out to maybe it was Horn Point, we stepped out to graduate. This was after the pandemic and everyone had been hiding out and not getting together. So it was a really joyful day. I won't talk about, but I do want to mention that Maryland Sea Grant and UMCES have had a collaboration with NSF funding for many years, doing internships for undergraduates at CBL and Horn Point. And that at CBL and Horn Point, there is a 5-year program funded by NSF called the SEAS Alliance that is an incredible outreach program to bring undergraduates into marine science. At IMET, our internship program started over 20 years ago using funding from that NOAA program that I'll talk about later. And it was used to support interns for 9 weeks. It's paid them a stipend, gave them housing and travel. And like other internships, it gave them experience with real research at the, doing computer work and bench work, sometimes field work. One of the important pieces of that's really been cemented into it is working with them to look at how to visualize and communicate their science. And so we're going to hear from Ian later that this is just a preview. Another piece that's evolved over the years is the nature of the Friday lunches that we have. We've always had a Friday get together with the interns, a couple of hours, feed them pizza or something nicer, have them discuss their progress, but also have them meet scientists who are generally not white or generally people that are involved in social justice or environmental professions a little bit outside of the realm, say, that I might be in. And we've also included discussions of identity in science, and I'll get into that in a second. Another piece that's entered of late is using art. So instead of talking about STEM, we're talking about STEAM. So Dr. Kate Gillespie, who is an alumna of our LMR CSC and intern program, is a biologist, and she is also a published author and poet, and she comes in and does workshops with our students. The program goals are pretty familiar: expanding scientific knowledge, communication skills, that very important piece of having the interns expand or create a network and an awareness of science careers. Also very important is gaining confidence in themselves as a scientist and identifying as a scientist. And we always encourage them to think about what are their options, what are their goals, and what do they want to do. All the logos on this page are here to remind me that this program that started with NOAA funding is now being continued for the last, at least 5 years with philanthropic money from different foundations and different donors. And so we've maintained a program that supports 10 interns, probably $100,000 a year from these other sources. And that's a really important way to leverage what we got started on federal funding. This is a pat on the back for ourselves here. In 2020 and 2021, the pandemic made in-person internships impossible everywhere. And we very quickly realized that if we didn't do something alternative, that a lot of students wouldn't have an internship experience that first year. And so I can't thank all the people enough who were involved in this, but you can imagine there were dozens of people, especially Rose Jagus, some other faculty members, Tetsuo Bachvarov, graduate students, and our administrators, who pulled together a virtual internship, and we shipped laptops to all the students who applied and were accepted, and we developed big data and visualization and synthesis projects with them. It was not easy for anyone involved, but we did do it for 2 years. I think a really interesting and really key piece of our internships is how much cohort building we try to do. An important person in that cohort building is Keith Snipes. He's an actor, a Shakespearean actor who is well aware of how one might feel a little bit out of place, because he's a Shakespearean actor in a realm that is usually very Eurocentric, and maybe not so much lately, but certainly in the beginning of his career, found itself always, doing a double take when they saw a Black man in a Shakespearean production. He's a great guy. He's really engaging, and he meets with the students a couple of times to lead them through discussions on their identity, and also and just kind of relating his story as a way to open up discussions.
And actually, Eric, if you could wrap up in 2 or 3 minutes, just so we can get lots of questions, I think.
And so the LMR CSC program is run through the NOAA, through UMES. It includes 6 other institutions: Dell State, Hampton, Rasmus, and University of Oregon. We have students that are in this program are accepted into a graduate program at any one of those 6 universities. At UMES and UMCES, that's the MEES program. Many of you in Maryland will know about this, but it's a consortium of 5 universities that does a graduate program between them. They need to have a certain GPA, have US residency, and identified as an underrepresented minority. And they receive not just full support, but they receive conference support, an internship at NOAA for 3 months, additional training, and in professional work. We've got a lot to brag about for the graduates here from UMCES. Many of them have gone on to careers in NOAA, which makes NOAA very happy. Amanda Lawrence, Nick Coleman, Ben Fry, Shadesha Green, and Mahatmar Hanif are all at NOAA jobs. We have 5 current fellows, and we're going to be recruiting another 2 every year for the next 3 years. What I'm really particularly happy about is that our interns, some of those interns went on to become fellows in the LMR CSC program, and those fellows come back and they really want to talk to the summer interns and share their experience and their enthusiasm. So we really get the full cycle. So what have we learned? What would I like to say to you? I think that more is better, especially for younger engagement. And as we get into the discussion, I'd like to talk about our work with local MSIs to get into middle schools and high schools. Our partnerships are key. I think this is a good theme for the CRC. We didn't do anything alone, and we won't get very far if we try to work alone. Persistence is important. Rose knows that, I know that, many of you know that. By being around for so long, we have an identity. People know who we are, they know where to find us, and we keep those relationships going. It's a lot of work. So, and as I mentioned, I think one thing we need to work on more is getting more youth into it, and that's where we're starting to reach out to local K-12 schools. And I'll stop there.
Great, thanks, Eric. And we're going to hold questions and we'll take them all in one batch. So, Dr. Laumann, you're up next.
Great, thank you. I'll just share my screen. And hopefully you're all seeing my presentation. I will move the
Yep, you look good.
bar over. Thanks for letting me speak to you all today. I'll be talking about some work that was done at the Integration and Application Network to develop a coastal adaptation report card for Maryland's coastal counties. And this is an example of how we can assess and communicate progress in ecosystem recovery and in preparing human communities for things like climate change and all the threats that it brings. As you all know, climate change is already impacting coastal communities, especially those in Maryland, and in Maryland, adaptation is ongoing. Some of the impacts of climate change that we've been seeing are migration of important fishery species away from the shores, coastal erosion, in storm surge and flooding. And some of the adaptation efforts that are ongoing and have been ongoing for quite some time are shoreline protection, restoration of wetlands, and installations of green infrastructure. And despite all of this investment in adaptation, there remained a need to set goals or targets for adaptation and to clarify exactly what is happening and find a way to track that and track improvements. And so the report card was born. Essentially, we developed this report card to assess whether adaptation efforts are currently enough. And the two main questions we asked in doing this were, how do we measure adaptation and how do we measure the success of adaptation? Before answering these questions, we did a literature review of all of the studies worldwide that have been done in how to identify indicators and measure adaptation. And what we found was there are many, many studies that suggest some indicators that may potentially be useful in assessing adaptation, but none of these studies actually did assess it. So this really was a novel effort. We followed the IAN report card process, which is a 5-step process, and it's entirely stakeholder driven, beginning with co-designing a report card. And I'll walk through steps 1 through 4. And of course, those steps end with the co-production of a report card. We engaged over 125 stakeholders from across Maryland's 16 coastal counties, and we are considering Baltimore City as a county here. And stakeholders came from many different sectors. We had representation from teachers, government officials, general citizens, citizen scientists, pretty much anyone you can possibly imagine was involved and contributed to this process. The co-design aspect of the report card began with identifying what adaptation is in the eyes of our stakeholders in order to determine what it was we were going to assess. And working with these stakeholders, we came up with the definition for adaptation as the processes and actions that are taken to improve the ability of a community or ecosystem to respond to and withstand climate change impacts. The next step was to choose indicators that we would use to assess adaptation. And we went through a long process, several months of meetings with stakeholders to choose these indicators, which we selected by asking stakeholders what threats of climate change they're already experiencing, what adaptation efforts are ongoing in their communities, and what efforts they would like to see that are not yet happening. And from a long list of indicators, we came up with 15 that we were able to measure. An indicator must have data already available or else you can't assess it. And our 15 indicators fit within 4 categories determined by our stakeholders. These are socioeconomic, ecosystem, planning, and flooding categories. And I'll go through each of these in a few minutes. But for each indicator, we had to determine thresholds by which we calculated grades. And a threshold is a target condition that tells us what adaptation is or what meets the level of adaptation required. And these are typically based on science and legislative goals. And in some cases, goals had not been set for adaptation actions that were already ongoing in Maryland. So we identified these threshold conditions to measure these indicators by consulting with experts and stakeholders with knowledge in particular indicators. We then compared the current condition of each indicator to the threshold, and by doing so, scored each indicator on a scale of 0 to 100%, or the A through F letter grade scale that you see in school report cards, where a 0% score is an F and completely misses adaptation goals, and a 100% score meets adaptation goals and scores an A. And we use stoplight colors, so as you move towards the dark green color, your scores are improving, and as you move towards the red colors, your scores are decreasing. I'll go a little bit into two of the indicators. The socioeconomic category refers to indicators that can detail or tell us about financial and property loss caused by climate events and how prepared businesses and people are for those losses. Looking particularly at repetitive loss properties, which is a very important indicator. These are properties that have more than 2 flood insurance claims in 10 years, and they can be mitigated or adapted to withstand climate change events. One example is this house on the slide is being raised above flood levels. The threshold for this is that all of these properties that are categorized as repetitive loss properties should be mitigated. Using data from the Maryland Department of Emergency Management, we found that, in fact, very few of these properties are mitigated, and the score was 11%, which you can see on the wheel here. 11% falls within the failing or F grade, and it is shown in red here. Within the socioeconomic category, we did have 2 indicators that score a B, loss coverage, and that's insurance coverage for properties that may experience loss due to flooding, and preserved farmland. Business disruption, which is the financial loss that businesses experience when they have to shut down due to flood events, or as we just saw, COVID, and our businesses in our coastal counties are at a C level. Some of them are prepared for these disruptions and some are not and would struggle to recover. I'll highlight one other indicator in the flooding category, and this category includes only indicators that relate particularly to climate change flooding. Critical facilities are those facilities that must continue to operate during emergencies, and they can include hospitals, fire stations, search and rescue, emergency shelters, anything like that. And according to FEMA, even a slight chance of flooding of any of these facilities is too great a threat. And working with our stakeholders and using that definition, we determined that our threshold would be no critical facilities should be located in flood hazard areas. We got data from the Maryland Hazard Mitigation Plan and found that, again, many of these facilities are in flood hazard areas. So again, we receive an F score. This one's a 10%, and it's shown here in red. And the flooding category has a score of C. Category scores are calculated as the average of all of the scores of indicators within that category. Ecosystem indicators refer to ecosystems that are both threatened by and that protect us from climate change events, as well as the beneficial use of dredge materials, which can be used to restore wetlands and islands. That is ongoing in Maryland. And this is our best scoring indicator category, with both wetlands and the amount of dredge materials used for restoration scoring A's, and forests and shoreline erosion scoring B's. Finally, our planning category looks at whether or not we are prepared with sufficient plans to deal with climate change issues, and whether the maps that exist to facilitate planning are sufficient. In this category, scores a B, and you'll note that flood mapping scores a C, but there are efforts ongoing to improve this score as we speak. Overall, Maryland scores a B-. That is the average of all of the category scores. There are some areas where we need significant improvement and some where we're doing well. What does this tell us, or what is the real utility of this report card? It's to help us make recommendations for future adaptation efforts and to identify needs. So our red indicators, those critical facilities and repetitive loss properties, require extra effort to improve, which could be mitigating critical facilities or carefully considering where we site future facilities, and providing financial assistance for home and business owners who can't necessarily afford to mitigate their repetitive loss properties. Yellow indicators also need some improved and increased effort. And of course, we don't want to ignore our green indicators. Just because we don't have wetlands loss going on now doesn't mean we can ignore it, because wetlands are still being threatened and we still really, really rely on them to help protect us from flooding. And finally, my biggest recommendations are to update and refine this report card so that we can use it to track progress, which was one of the initial goals of developing it, and to expand. And by expand, I mean looking at a finer scale and a broader scale. And next month, we'll be starting our first county level report card with Charles County. And I'd like to propose here that a Bay-wide report card might be valuable, particularly as the Chesapeake Bay states collaborate on adaptation and try to prepare ourselves for climate change. Challenges, I'll just put this here because I got a question beforehand. What are the biggest challenges that we faced? One was missing data. There were some indicators that were suggested and really valued by stakeholders, but data were not available, so we could not assess those indicators. And in other cases, the sheer amount of data, we had some indicators that had so much data that sorting through it and determining which data sources we should use took quite a bit of time, as well as establishing thresholds, which we did, I would say, with lots and lots of support from our stakeholders. And finally, incorporating equity was a challenge that we considered, we discussed a lot, but we were not able to do in this iteration of the report card. But as we develop report cards at county levels and ideally, hopefully at city levels, we'll be able to look at equity and disparities among different counties and different cities. So for more information, you can see the full report card on the IAN website, or you can contact me, and the IAN Twitter and Instagram handles are up there for you. And I am happy to turn it back over. I think I went a little bit over time.
Well, thank you, Katie May. That was great. And thanks to Eric as well. So I certainly invite folks, thanks for so many of you putting your name and contact details in the chat. Please feel free to post your questions in the chat. And perhaps, Lauren, if I miss any of the questions, please feel free to interrupt. So the floor is open for Q&A on any of the topics we've touched on from the state of Maryland. And I see we're also joined by Bill Dennison and Dr. Yegas. And so if you would like to add any additional comment to the presentations you just saw, please feel free to do so. And Katie May, while people are doing that, it's, I think it's worth perhaps explaining a little bit that IAN, of course, is doing these kinds of activities all over the world. And sometimes these report cards you have really founded in the way that the important agencies or stakeholders have not either wanted or to get engaged. But it does seem that you've really perfected the art of building this engagement where the outcome and the final deliverable is valued, and the impetus to continue doing this on a regular cycle to track progress. And I just wondered if you had anything to add from what you've learned in ensuring that the results are embraced.
Yes, stakeholder engagement is a huge process, and it is the first thing we do and something we build on throughout report card development. And the most important thing is to make sure you get a cross section of stakeholders, including people who are already very engaged in the topic, as well as people who aren't engaged in the topic. We developed this report card during COVID. It was meant to be developed through in-person workshops, which are, of course, a bit easier in some cases to get stakeholders to attend. No one wants to sit in Zoom meetings for hours and hours. But we reached out to stakeholders through surveys, social media, and working with our partners on the report card, Department of Natural Resources. And this is really something that Bill Dennison and our other leaders at Ian have mastered, is our stakeholder engagement process. But I think getting buy-in is the most important aspect of a report card. And the way to do that is to just talk to people and help them see how the issue, the ecosystem, or the adaptation efforts that are needed will affect them specifically. Bring it to their level and show them that it really does matter, and help them see how it has a personal impact on them.
Great, thanks, Katie May. And I'll take one more quick question for you. I think this is probably a fairly short answer, and then we'll go to some of the education questions that have popped up. And Dr. Sanford just asked, for the report cards, are all sectors weighted equally in assigning the final grade?
Yes, for this they are. Other report cards, they may be weighted by, some indicators may be weighted by population size or geographic area, but for this report card, they're all weighted equally. And that was a decision made by our stakeholders.
Right, thank you. And perhaps now we'll go to Eric Schott. So there's several questions here, Eric. One of them from Dr. Thompson. How are you approaching K through 12 outreach, and what outcomes are you aiming for?
So we're new to K through 12 outreach at IMET. I know that UMCES at large has other people who are experts in K through 12 outreach. We are reaching out to local schools, and some of this is coming through collaboration with Coppin State University and Morgan State University in writing proposals to the NSF for STEM education grants. We're currently involved in the resubmission of a proposal that looks at trust in science in those communities, in the communities in South and West Baltimore. That's rather high level. A more immediate level is we just completed our open house, and we had a group of students and teachers come from the Cherry Hill Elementary Middle School visiting us because we went out to them with an outreach tool that we developed in collaboration with an artist. We have an artist in residence program here, and that let us build something called a bio buggy that brought us to the school to their science day. And the bio buggy has microscopes on it and video screens for students to look at what we're seeing. And we talk to them about anything they want to talk about, but including aquatic life, and usually the small aquatic life. So that's not a lot, but it's the starting point. And I think what we're seeing is that with schools being so strapped, teachers and everyone being so busy, we need to learn how to make their lives easier while we reach out to them, not make it harder. I hope that's helpful.
Great, Eric. And I guess from the question, there could well be some follow-up after the webinar, because that's an extremely good question. And there's also a question here for you, Eric, from Professor Dobbs. Fred, good to see you. Thanks for joining us. And this, I think, is, again, a very common problem, but he's asking that with the LMR CSC fellows, it's great they've got 3 years full support. And he was curious, just what is the stipend? And have you also experienced what many of folks have of certain institutions stepping in and really upping the ante, which is great for the student, but can really affect enrollment? So a two-part question there.
Yeah, thank you. Yes, the stipend is just around 30,000. It's going up, the latest iteration, and I believe that it's going up by more than 10% this year because NOAA is mandating that it be higher within that award. It squeezes it a bit. It means that they didn't change the amount of our award, they just changed the terms. In fact, it's called a cooperative agreement, which allows NOAA to change the rules anytime they want. What we've done to deal with that is we can also go to the MEES program, the system-wide program, and say, they have funding to enhance offers like that. The funding can either be used to round out the 3 years to a 5-year offer so that the student comes in and they have a 5-year plan right up front. We had a student like that turn us down this year. And I think it was not, I don't think it was just the money. I think it was that he had an offer in a location he liked better, but that is an issue. So the short answer is we do have ways to bump that up. Within the LMR CSC budget, it's sort of capped in the low 30s, but it doesn't prohibit us from adding other funds.
Great. Thanks, Eric. And just going down through these, I see that Dr. Jaegers had asked a question that Annie responded to. And then also from Dr. Katula, UVA, William and Mary and ODU have a resilience adaptation feasibility tool that they score Virginia local governments with. Has there been any collaboration on something more Bay-wide? And so, Katie May, perhaps we'll go back to you. I know that's very close to your heart.
Yes, we last month presented at the Bay Program's Climate Resiliency Work Group meeting and began discussions about potentially collaborating with them. There are some important differences between their effort and our report card, which I think we can both learn from one another. And of course, it is all dependent on funding, but NOAA is helping facilitate that conversation that I just got an email about today. So hopefully we can find some funding to work together and learn from one another.
Right. Yeah, thank you, Katie May. And I think that's certainly a role too, perhaps for CRC to consider too. It seems it's so important and a great way also of demonstrating the important role of science in the decision-making that our various states are making. So going down through the questions here, I think Dr. Jaegers' question, it's worth perhaps exploring that too, Katie May. And the question was, how do you decide on priority for report cards when you're dealing with different counties and different cities? And I assume there the question is partly when you're scaling down to that level, is it a subset of the report card, or do you do something different for those local governments?
So with Charles County, this is the first report card that will be at the county level. We are using all of the same indicators, but we're also going to be working with stakeholders and starting from the beginning and developing up to 6 new indicators that community members of that county value. The intention is that this can be a supplement to the overall Maryland state report card, and ideally Charles County will be the first of many. Prioritization of these is really currently based on who is able to fund it. I do have specific counties that I would like to work in, particularly those that don't necessarily see as much adaptation effort as the others, and I'm actively seeking funding to do report cards in those counties. And we're really hoping that the flagship Charles County report card will boost more interest and will help us find the ability to expand to more counties.
Great. Thanks, Katie May. And also just, yeah, please.
I'd forgotten an important piece in the response to Macon Thompson's question about K through 12, and that is we recognize how strapped we are at IMET. I mean, UMCES is a very lean team, if you will, and expanding our outreach means that all of us have become very busy, and I lauded all these people for working so hard, but we can't make everyone work that hard all the time. So we've recently been awarded a grant from the France Merrick Foundation to hire an outreach coordinator for the next 2 years. And that's really going to be a game changer for us in terms of allowing us to have consistent communications with our partners, especially with schools. And we intend to turn that into a permanent position. I think we don't know how we'll do it, but we must. And so we have the first 2 years for that.
Great. Well, thank you. And there's other questions here. Adrian, thanks very much for your supportive comment. We will certainly note that. Dr. Jaegers also said he'd love to, or she and her team would love to see a report card on Baltimore City. There's a suggestion there to involve students, particularly through programs like ERIC in the development of the report card. That certainly makes sense around diversity and equity.
And we did have some students from some HBCUs participate in report card development for this one. But of course, in the future, and as we develop more report cards, we would love to have more students involved.
And I think I had the same thought that Rose did, in fact, that we have had our students work on local issues, of course, from the very sciencey end, but a lot of them come to our program enthusiastic and eager to work on those solutions. So I think that it's a perfect link to the Ian group.
Right. Thanks, Eric. And then this, I think, is also targeted towards you. Shannon said, could you elaborate a little bit more on the networking opportunities of the internship program?
Yeah, I appreciate you giving me the opportunity, because that's something else I missed. Our internships get the students in touch with the lab that they're working with, but because of the way that we structure it, they also meet students from other laboratories. And many of our speakers that they meet are from either agencies or environmental nonprofits. And the people that come to speak always want to be in touch with the students, and they make themselves available and make it clear to the students that they should reach out to them, and they share their contact information. I think that's one way that the interns can be networked. The interns also meet our graduate students. And I think that may be one of the more powerful interactions, is that our grad students are almost to a person outgoing, really understand their role in bringing up the next generation of scientists. And so those guys make contacts that I'd have nothing to do with, but we see it happening.
Great. Yeah, thanks, Eric. And if I could just add to that too, perhaps you could just mention how students apply for the program.
Students apply for the program through our website. We do send out stuff on social media and to a network. So we have a website that's always active. It gets updated annually. That sends them to an application form, and then it's kind of a standard application process. I'm not sure if I.
No, that's fine. Just where to find it.
Yeah, look, if you Google IMET summer internship, that's the first hit on any search engine.
Right. Let's see. And actually, before we go to Lauren's question, I would also make the plea that I know right across the watershed in our institutions, there's several programs, to name a couple. The one at Frostburg State University that's just started that targets internships for minority students. UMBC also has an NSF-funded program where they're looking for placements, where these students can spend a certain time of amount during the academic year embedded in local government or companies or other agencies. So we're always looking for those kind of opportunities.
That's another slide I didn't show you all, but I can share that, which is, I have mentored 2 of those students. It's a great program, and I love the model, the iCare model. I'll put that in there. It's UMBC iCare.
Right. And then, Eric, you're still on tap here. Could you just say a few words about specific activities to try and engage Native students or bringing Native perspectives to the program?
That's something we just haven't addressed. I can't say that we've addressed it specifically. Rose, if you're aware of something that I'm not, but that's not a specific, hasn't been a specific thrust. We do get applicants who identify as Indigenous. For example, this summer we're bringing a student in from Guam who identifies as an Indigenous Pacific Islander.
Right, thanks. And I would perhaps also, perhaps add to that I know Maryland Sea Grant has had some success recruiting science fellows, but it's we always welcome that kind of perspective, and I know that Dr. Dennison and Katie May, you've been searching that for those kind of contacts with their report card. Let's see, Brenda. Okay. So I think we're almost out of time here. We're beginning to lose some of the audience. So if there's no other pressing questions, we'll keep the chat open until 1 o'clock. If you have a question, we'll get responses back to you. But I would like to just take the opportunity to thank both Dr. May and Dr. Schott for taking your time to share your programs with us today. It's very much appreciated. It'll just have to be a virtual applause here. So thanks to everyone. I'd also like to emphasize that the next webinar, CRC webinar, will be on June the 21st. Please consider joining us for that. And if you do have any questions, please feel free to follow up either with CRC directly or any of the speakers you've heard from today. The whole purpose of this is to enhance our networking and growing our community around these really important issues. So many thanks everyone for your time today, and we'll see you all on June the 21st.